Sign it, Elena, Matteo said, sliding the folder across the white tablecloth without even looking up. Everyone's watching. Don't make this ugly. She looked down at the words. Divorce papers. Sitting next to a cake that still said Happy 30th Anniversary in gold icing. The candle's not even burned down yet. 30 years, Elena said quietly. And you couldn't wait until the cake was cut. There's never a good time, Matteo said. So I picked tonight. 40 guests. 40 people who owed her favors, who'd eaten at her table, who'd called her the reason the Moretti family stayed respected instead of just feared. Not one of them said a word. Not one of them looked at her. Elena picked up the pen. Okay, Matteo, she said, signing her name for the last time as his wife. Okay. 2 years later, 5 grown men who used to bow their heads when she walked into a room would be standing at her garden gate, hats in their hands, begging her to come back and save everything Matteo had nearly burned to the ground. And Matteo himself, the man who once ruled half the region without ever raising his voice, would be sitting across from her, waiting to hear whether she'd let him keep any of it. But that's getting ahead of things. Let's go back to where it actually started, 30 years earlier, long before any of them knew how the story would end. Before Matteo ever handed her that folder, before the cake and the candles and the silence, Elena Moretti was already running half the empire, and nobody outside the family knew her name. Mrs. Moretti, the senator wants to move the meeting to Thursday, her assistant said, holding the phone against her chest. Tell him Thursday works, but I want the zoning report before he sits down, Elena replied without looking up from the documents in front of her. And call Frank Bellini. Tell him the shipment schedule needs to change, or we lose the warehouse deal. She said it the way other women order coffee. Calm. Certain. Done. Nobody watching her glide through a hotel lobby in a gray coat would have guessed she held more real power than most of the men who called themselves captains. She never carried a weapon. She didn't need one. Elena's weapon was trust, the kind you can't buy, the kind that takes 30 years to build one relationship at a time. Matteo built the empire on fear. Elena built the roof that kept it standing. You worry too much about the politicians, Matteo told her once, laughing over dinner, years before any of this. I worry about the men with guns. The men with guns can be replaced in a week, Elena said. The politicians decide if we still have a business next year. Matteo never really listened when she said things like that. He just smiled, poured more wine, and let her handle the parts of the business he found boring. He never once considered that the boring parts were the ones actually keeping him alive. If you're enjoying this so far, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now where you are. And go ahead and hit subscribe and like this video, because Elena's story is only just getting started. By the time Matteo turned 60, something in him had shifted. He surrounded himself with younger advisors in sharp suits who called Elena old news behind closed doors, who whispered that a man like him deserved a wife who matched his image, not his age. Don Moretti, no disrespect, said Victor, his newest lieutenant. But people talk. They see a young Don's empire, and they see her. He said her, like he was describing old furniture. Matteo didn't defend her. He just nodded slowly, like the words confirmed something he'd already been thinking. She's done her part, he said. Maybe it's time for something different. Something different had a name. Isabella. 28, beautiful, ambitious, and completely uninterested in learning anything about the business she was marrying into. She wanted the mansion. She wanted the name. She wanted to be seen. Matteo wanted to feel young again. So he made his decision, and he made it in the cruelest way he knew how, publicly, in front of the people whose respect Elena had spent 30 years earning. After the papers were signed, Elena didn't cry in front of anyone. She waited until she was alone in the car, and even then, she allowed herself exactly 2 minutes before she wiped her face and met her driver's eyes in the mirror. Take me home, Sal, she said. My real home. Not his. Sal had worked for the family for 20 years. He'd never once heard her voice shake until that night. Mrs. Moretti, he said carefully, whatever you need. Anything at all. I need you to remember, Elena said, staring out the window, that I never asked anyone in that room to fight for me tonight. I watched to see who would. Not one person moved. Sal said nothing. There was nothing to say. Elena took the modest settlement Matteo offered, enough for a small house outside the city and nothing more, and she disappeared from the world she built. No lawyers fighting for more. No calls to old allies asking them to pick a side. You're not going to fight this? Her sister Marie asked, stunned, sitting across from her in the new, much smaller kitchen. Fight for what? Elena said. A man who threw 30 years away in front of a room full of witnesses because someone told him I made him look old? You built that empire, Elena. I built a life around a man who decided I was disposable the moment I stopped being convenient, Elena said. I'm done building things for people who tear them down. So what now? Marie asked. Elena looked out at her small, quiet garden. Now I water my tomatoes. Marie shook her head, half laughing, half heartbroken for her sister. 30 years of running an empire, and you're talking about vegetables. Empires don't need me to survive, Elena said. Not the way I thought they did. But those tomatoes will die without water by Friday. It's nice, for once, to matter to something that simple. She didn't cry again after that conversation. Not once. Not when she passed the old mansion on the way into town and saw new curtains in the windows. Not when she heard, secondhand, that Matteo's wedding photos had made the local paper. She planted a second row of tomatoes that spring, and a third the year after. Within months, Matteo married Isabella in a wedding twice as expensive and half as respected as anything Elena had ever organized. The old guests didn't come. The politicians sent gifts but not themselves. The captains smiled for photographs and said nothing behind closed doors, but everyone noticed who was missing. Isabella didn't notice or didn't care. She was too busy redecorating the mansion, firing staff who'd served the family for a decade, and spending money on things that made her feel powerful instead of things that kept the family powerful. Why do we still use this old accountant? Isabella asked one night, tossing a folder onto Matteo's desk. Get someone modern. Someone who understands real money. The old accountant had kept the family's books clean for 15 years. His replacement lasted 4 months before federal investigators started asking questions about accounts nobody could explain. It was the first crack. It would not be the last. One by one, the pillars Elena had spent 30 years placing began to crumble. Senator Whitfield, who once called Elena the only honest person in that family, stopped taking Matteo's calls entirely. Tell him I'm in meetings, the senator told his assistant, again and again, until eventually he didn't have to say it anymore. Contracts that once flowed easily through the family's legitimate businesses dried up overnight. Bellini Logistics lost 3 major clients in a single quarter. What happened to the Hartwell contract? Matteo demanded, slamming his hand on the boardroom table. Victor shifted uncomfortably. They said they wanted someone more established. More trustworthy. We are established. With respect, Don Moretti, Victor said carefully. Mrs. Moretti used to handle those relationships personally. She knew what people needed before they asked. Matteo said nothing. He didn't want to hear her name, but he was starting to hear it everywhere. The captains, once kept in line by Elena's quiet diplomacy, began turning on each other. Small disputes she would have settled with one phone call now exploded into open conflict. You went behind my back on the Delgado shipment, one captain shouted at another in a warehouse. Because nobody's running this family the way it used to run, the other snapped back. There's no order anymore. Just chaos with a young wife attached to it. Word of the infighting reached rival families fast. The Castellanos, kept in check for years by careful diplomacy, started testing the borders. The Morettis are weak, Salvatore Castellano told his own counsel, smiling. The old man lost his mind for a pretty face, and now the whole empire is falling apart. We move in. Quietly. Piece by piece. Money began disappearing too. Not obvious theft, nothing Matteo could point to and punish. Small leaks. Inflated invoices. Isabella, more interested in appearances than oversight, signed off on transfers she never questioned. Isabella, where did $400,000 go from the Meridian account? Matteo asked one night, staring at a laptop screen that made no sense to him. I don't know, Matteo, I just approve what Richard tells me to approve, Isabella said, barely looking up from her phone. That's his job, not mine. Richard, the modern financial advisor Isabella had hired, was quietly moving money into accounts with his own name on them. Nobody caught it for 8 months. Elena would have caught it in 8 days. 2 years after that anniversary dinner, the empire that once stood as one of the most respected and feared families in the region was hollowed out from the inside. Matteo still had soldiers. He still had fear. But fear without structure is just noise, and noise doesn't hold an empire together. The family council, 5 men who had once bowed their heads to Matteo without question, met privately, without him, for the first time in the family's history. We all know what this is, said old Tomas, the eldest of the council, his voice heavy. We know what broke this family. Say it then, Victor said. He wasn't smiling anymore. Elena, Tomas said. We threw her out with the trash and called it modernizing. And we watched everything she held together fall apart in 2 years. Nobody argued. She was never just his wife, said another council member, Dominic. She's the reason half of us are still rich men instead of dead or in prison. So what do we do? Victor asked. Mateo won't hear it. He'll call it disloyalty. Old Tomas stood slowly. Then we go around him. We go to her directly. And we pray she doesn't laugh in our faces. Elena's small house sat at the end of a gravel road, tomatoes climbing wooden stakes in the garden, a life built entirely without anyone's permission. She was kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds, when Sal's old car pulled up, except this time he wasn't alone. 5 men stepped out. Men who once wouldn't refill her wine glass without Mateo's nod now stood at her gate, hats in their hands like schoolboys outside the principal's office. Mrs. Moretti, old Tomas said, we need to talk to you. Elena stood, brushing dirt from her knees, looking at each of them slowly. The gate's open, she said. Doesn't mean you're welcome. But come in anyway. I could use the company. They sat around her small kitchen table, the same kind of table where Marie had once asked if she planned to fight for anything. We need you to come back, Tomas said finally. The family's falling apart. Contracts are gone. Politicians won't answer calls. Captains are at each other's throats. And the Castellanos are moving on our territory like we're already dead. Elena poured tea, unbothered, as if he'd just told her the weather forecast. And Mateo sent you, she asked. Mateo doesn't know we're here, Victor admitted. If he did, he'd call it betrayal. It is betrayal, Elena said. Just not the kind you think. She set the teapot down. You're not betraying Mateo. You're finally admitting the truth he made all of you pretend not to see for 30 years. Nobody answered that. I'm not coming back to be his wife again, Elena said. That woman doesn't exist anymore. You buried her at that anniversary dinner in front of everyone, and none of you said a word. We know, Dominic said quietly. We're not asking for the wife. We're asking for the leader. Elena studied them for a long moment. Then you'll listen to my terms, she said. Or you can go home and watch the rest of it burn. The council returned 2 days later, this time with Mateo, dragged along by men who no longer feared his temper more than they feared total collapse. He stood at her gate looking older than she remembered. Not defeated yet, but close. Elena, he said. Don Moretti, she replied, formal distant. Come in. Let's talk business. Inside, she laid it out plainly, the way she'd once laid out negotiations between rival families, calm and exact, no room for argument. I'll return, Elena said. But not as anyone's wife. Not as a symbol. I return as the head of every legitimate business this family owns, and every major decision goes through me first. A council governs going forward, not one man's ego. Every member of this family, including you, Mateo, answers to the same rules as everyone else. You want to run my empire, Mateo said, and for a moment the old fire came back into his voice. I want to save what's left of our empire, Elena said. Something you nearly destroyed in 2 years, chasing a feeling instead of protecting what took 30 to build. Mateo's jaw tightened. Around the table, the council stayed silent, watching him. And if I refuse, he asked. Then Salvatore Castellano finishes what your ego started, Elena said simply. And in a year, none of you will have anything left to argue about. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Fine, Mateo said finally, the word costing him more than any decision he'd made in years. Fine. Your terms. Say it in front of the council, Elena said. Not to me. To them. I want no confusion later about what was agreed tonight. Mateo looked around the table at the 5 men who had once obeyed his every word without question. Men who were now watching him the way you watch someone finally telling the truth after years of lying. Elena runs the business, he said slowly. Her decisions are final. The council governs. I answer to the same rules as everyone else in this family, starting tonight. Old Tomas nodded once. It was enough. Around the table, Dominic exhaled like a man finally allowed to breathe after holding it in for 2 years, and Victor, who had once called Elena old news behind closed doors, was the first one to stand and pull out her chair. Elena didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She just stood, smoothed her skirt, and said, Then we start tomorrow. Bring me every financial record from the last 2 years. Every contract. Every name. The months that followed were quiet, methodical, and did more damage to the family's problems than violence ever could have. This account, Elena said, tapping a folder in front of Richard, Moved $400,000 through 3 shell companies that trace back to an apartment you own under your mother's name. Richard went pale. Mrs. Moretti, I can explain. You can explain it to the men waiting outside, Elena said calmly. Or you can return every dollar and disappear quietly. I'd suggest the second option. It comes with your health intact. Richard chose the second option. By noon the next day, the $400,000 was back in the Meridian account, along with a written confession Elena filed away in a drawer she kept locked. She didn't need to use it. She just needed to know it was there. That's it, Victor asked, watching Richard's car disappear down the driveway. No punishment? No message sent. The message was sent the moment he handed the money back and drove away with his life still intact, Elena said. Fear buys silence for a week. A debt someone owes you buys loyalty for years. I'd rather collect the second one. Victor didn't argue. He was starting to understand why the old captains used to say that crossing Matteo got you hurt, but crossing Elena got you erased quietly from every room that mattered. Senator Whitfield, Elena said into the phone 2 weeks later, I understand you've been avoiding my husband's calls. Elena, the senator's voice brightened immediately. Is that really you? I heard you'd left. I came back, Elena said. Not for him. For the parts of this business that actually deserve saving. I think you and I still have that in common. There was a pause, then a warm laugh. Come to dinner Thursday. We'll talk like the old days. By Friday, Bellini Logistics had its first new legitimate contract in over a year. The captains, expecting more of the chaos that had ruled the family for 2 years, found something they hadn't felt in a long time under Elena's quiet authority. Order. You too, Elena said, standing between the captains who'd nearly come to blows over the Delgado shipment. We'll split the territory the way it was originally agreed, and you'll both apologize to the men you dragged into your pride. With respect, Mrs. Moretti, this isn't how. This is exactly how it's going to be, Elena said, her voice never rising. I didn't survive 30 years in this family by asking nicely twice. They apologized. The infighting stopped within a week. Old Tomas watched it happen from the back of the room, arms crossed, a small smile on his face he didn't bother to hide. 30 years I watched her do this at dinner parties, he said quietly to Dominic. I thought it was just good manners. I didn't understand until now that it was strategy the whole time. We all made that mistake, Dominic said. That's exactly the problem. Even the Castellanos noticed the shift. The Morettis aren't retreating anymore, Salvatore Castellano said, reading a new round of reports on his desk. Someone reorganized their entire operation in 3 months. It's her, his advisor said. The wife. The one they threw out. Salvatore leaned back slowly. Then maybe it's time we stopped testing their borders and started respecting them again. Elena negotiated peace with the Castellanos the same way she'd handled everything for 30 years, through favors remembered and old debts quietly settled, not threats. Where Matteo would have started a war out of pride, Elena ended one before it began. She met Salvatore Castellano herself, alone, no soldiers standing behind her, at a small restaurant neither family had any claim over. You came without protection, Salvatore said, half impressed, half suspicious, as she sat down across from him. I came with 30 years of relationships your father used to respect, Elena said. That's protection enough. Or we can find out the hard way whether that's true. Salvatore studied her for a long moment, then laughed, low and genuine. My father always said the smartest person in the Moretti family wasn't the one with his name on the door. Your father was right, Elena said. Now, let's talk about the border, and let's talk about it like people who both have better things to do than bury each other's soldiers. They reached an agreement before dessert arrived. As for Isabella, her ambition had left a trail Elena uncovered without much effort at all. You transferred family funds into a private account under a company you registered yourself, Elena said, laying documents in front of her in the mansion's study. You manipulated at least 2 council members using information you had no business accessing. And you fired staff who could have exposed exactly what you were doing. Isabella's face went white, then red. You think you can just walk back in here and... I think, Elena said calmly, that you mistook a wedding ring for real power. It was never yours. It was only ever borrowed. Matteo, standing in the doorway, said nothing in her defense. He just watched, finally understanding how completely he'd been played by someone who saw a title and nothing more. Isabella left the mansion within the month, stripped of every privilege the marriage had given her. She tried calling a few of the captains afterward, hoping someone still owed her a favor. Mrs. Moretti already spoke to me. One of them told her flatly before hanging up. There's only one Mrs. Moretti anyone in this family answers to now. She didn't call again after that. With Isabella gone and the books clean, Elena turned her attention to something Matteo hadn't touched in years. The family's reputation outside the business itself. She reopened the scholarship fund she'd quietly run for a decade before the divorce. The one Isabella had canceled within a month of the wedding to save money for renovations nobody needed. You're spending family money on strangers' children, Matteo said, watching her sign the paperwork. I'm spending family money on the only investment that's never once betrayed us, Elena said. Goodwill. You should try it sometime. It's cheaper than lawyers. He didn't argue with that either. Late one evening, months after Elena's return, Matteo found her in the study, reviewing contracts by lamplight, exactly the way she used to when they were still married. You did in 6 months what I couldn't do in 2 years, he said quietly from the doorway. I did what I always did, Elena said, not looking up. You just weren't paying attention back then either. Matteo stepped further into the room. I was wrong, Elena. About all of it. I mistook loyalty for weakness. I mistook excitement for love. And I lost the only person who ever understood what this family actually needed to survive. Elena set down her pen and finally looked at him. I know, she said simply. Matteo sat down slowly in the chair across from her. The same chair he used to fall asleep in decades ago while she finished paperwork he never bothered to read. I used to think strength meant never needing anyone, he said quietly. I built my whole life around that idea. And I still ended up needing you more than I ever needed the soldiers, the money, any of it. I just didn't have the honesty to say that until I'd already lost you twice. You didn't lose me twice, Elena said. You lost me once at that dinner table in front of 40 people. Everything since then has just been you finding out what that actually cost. I'm asking for another chance, Matteo said. Not for the Empire. For us. Elena studied him for a long moment, the man she'd loved for 30 years, the man who'd handed her divorce papers over an anniversary cake in front of everyone who mattered. I forgive you, Matteo, she said quietly. I mean that. I'm not carrying the anger anymore. It was too heavy to keep. Hope flickered across his face. But forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing, Elena continued. I won't go back to a marriage where my worth only gets proven after I'm gone. You didn't lose me because the world changed. You lost me because you decided I was disposable, and it took watching everything collapse for you to remember what disposable people are actually worth. Elena, I'll run this family's business because it deserves saving, and because 30 years of my work still live inside it, Elena said. But I won't run your household again. Those are different things now. They'll stay different. Matteo nodded slowly, the last of the argument leaving him. There was nothing left to say that would change her answer, and some part of him, the part that had finally learned something, respected her too much to keep trying. Word spread through the whole family that Elena Moretti had never needed the Moretti name to have power. She'd only ever lent Matteo the illusion that the power was his. The council answered to her judgment now, not out of fear, but out of respect earned back one careful decision at a time. The captains kept their peace. The politicians kept their calls. The Castellanos kept their distance. And Matteo, once untouchable, watched every day as the woman he'd discarded rebuilt an empire he'd nearly burned to the ground, this time on her terms, not his. Weeks later, at a family gathering nobody had bothered to make into a celebration, Matteo found Elena on the terrace, watching the sunset over the vineyard the family had owned for 2 generations. Beautiful evening, Matteo said, standing beside her. Elena smiled faintly, eyes still on the horizon. Yes, she said. It's good to finally be home. Matteo smiled too, relieved, thinking he understood exactly what she meant. He had no idea she wasn't talking about the mansion at all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and comment what you learned from Elena's journey. Turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. See you in the next video.